guys, welcome back to Beautifully Bookish Bethany, where I have new videos every week about books and the geeky mom lifestyle. Subscribe for more bookish videos and hit that notification bell if you want to be notified every time I release a new video. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing with you adult and YA recommendations of sci-fi books for fantasy readers. Stay tuned. This is a video that you might find useful if you are a fantasy reader interested in getting into sci-fi, but maybe intimidated by science fiction, intimidated by the more hard sci-fi elements of it. I'm gonna offer you some suggestions of soft sci-fi or sci-fi that is kind of crossover into fantasy that might be a good transition point. Many of these books either have fantasy elements to them or use tropes that are often associated with fantasy books. And they're all ones that I think are good entry points for people who are used to reading fantasy but are interested in getting into sci-fi. Or if you read sci-fi and you want to get into fantasy and you're looking to read some softer sci-fi that has fantasy elements to it, this could be a good list for you as well. I have 10 recommendations for you today. 5 of them are YA and 5 of them are adult. So I'm going to start with my YA recommendations and then I will move on to my adult recommendations. I will try to remember to leave a timestamp in the video description down below if you want to skip to my adult recommendations. I know some people don't prefer reading YA, but since I read both, I thought I would include both on the video. So 4 of my recommendations share something in common. They are sci-fi books that have tropes around royalty. And often when you read royalty stories, they're fantasy stories. And so all of these in some way feel kind of like a fantasy story, even though they're not. My final recommendation is something a little bit different, so we'll get to that. First up is a classic that I'm sure a lot of people have heard of, and I have this in the new beautiful paperback cover. This is Cinder by Marissa Meyer. It's the first book in the Lunar Chronicles, and these are really, really fun. They're sci-fi retellings of classic fairy tales, but all set in the same world, and each book emphasizes a new character. So Cinder is obviously focused on Cinderella, and in this case, our Cinderella is a cyborg living in futuristic China, and it's really, really fun. I love this series. They've got romance in them, they've got adventure, they've got sci-fi elements, but because it's fairy tale retellings and includes royalty and kind of these romantic tropes to it, it feels a little bit similar to fantasy. And so I think these are a really great introduction for any readers who are interested in getting into sci-fi a little bit but are a little nervous. This is a good pick. My next recommendation is also very much a sci-fi romance with some royalty elements, and this is Brightly Burning by Alexa Donne. This is basically Jane Eyre in space, so less royalty and more, I guess, nobility, but it's really, really fun. And I think because it plays with the nobility and it has a lot of more character-driven romance pieces to it, it makes it feel easier to digest, even though it is a sci-fi book and you get elements of more solidly sci-fi world building in it. So this is one that I think is a lot of fun that's also worth picking up, and it has a really beautiful new cover on the paperback, so maybe I'll put that up here if you want to see that. Next is another book that's getting a cover redesign, and we're finally getting book 2, which I'm excited for. I might be due for a reread of this one because I loved it so much, and I kind of want the paperback because then it'll match. Anyway, this is Mirage by Somaiya Daoud. And this is sci-fi in that it is set in space, set on another planet, and has some technology elements to it, but it really reads more like a fantasy. It follows a girl from a more poor planet who is kidnapped from her home and brought to the palace to serve as the body double for the royal princess because somehow they look exactly alike. And so there's lots of court intrigue and forbidden romance, and I think it's inspired by Moroccan history and culture, but set in space on another planet with futuristic technology elements woven in. But because it's got these royalty pieces and follows characters more closely than it does hard sci-fi, it reads a little bit more like a fantasy. So this is another great crossover option. And my final YA recommendation in this category that kind of uses royalty type things as a trope is one of my favorite books of last year. I feel like I've talked about this all the time and I love it a whole lot. But this is The Kingdom by Jess Rothenberg. I love this book so much, and this is even more genre bendy than the other books in that it's also a kind of thriller slash murder mystery. and I think it's just done really, really well. This is set in a kind of apocalyptic United States, but most of the story takes place at a futuristic theme park that's sort of like Disneyland on steroids with more advanced technology that looks really amazing on the surface, but is hiding some rot underneath, perhaps. And at the theme park, they have these android sort of AI fantasists is what they call them, but they're really kind of like Disney princesses that all look different and like diverse on the outside, but actually they're all like androids, and they exist to make your dreams come true and make your park experience amazing. But there's a lot of like creepy stuff going on under the surface, and so we follow one of these fantasists' perspective, and it's set in a dual timeline. So one of the timeline narratives is in the past, following her as she's a fantasist in this theme park, and then in the future, a park employee has been murdered, and she is on trial for murder, and so the question is, not only did she commit the murder, but if she did, can she be convicted of it? What does it mean to be human? Can you commit murder if you're artificially intelligent? And I just think this is so smart, does things really, really well, and I love it. It's definitely sci-fi, but it also reads like a murder mystery, and it reads a little bit like fantasy because it's got these like fantastical elements to it with the theme park and the sort of fantasist princesses. Definitely would recommend checking this one out. And then before I move on to the adult books, I have one other YA sci-fi book that I want to recommend, and this is a little bit different. I would say that maybe this would be a good sci-fi book for urban fantasy readers. I feel like it's got some vibes that would mesh well if you like to read that genre. This is The Tesla Legacy by K.K. Perez. This is super interesting. It has sci-fi elements to it. It also reads like a very fast-paced thriller and has like secret societies. It has like really, really a lot of interesting stuff. So this I think doesn't get enough hype. It's just pretty well written. It follows a teen girl who's grown up with super overprotective parents because she has epilepsy. But then something weird happens involving her researching the history of Nikola Tesla, and it's kind of a superpower story plus hidden society secret story. It's really, really good. I actually have an interview with the author that I'll link up above if you want to check it out, and she kind of gets into the background of this and why she wrote it the way she did, and I thought it was really interesting. But yeah, this I think is another really good one. I think if you like urban fantasy, or if you like that kind of thriller element, this is a good one to pick up, and I hope we get a book 2 at some point. We'll see. Fingers crossed. So to review, these are the 5 YA books that I would recommend for fantasy readers who want to get into sci-fi. Now I'm going to move into my adult recommendations. First up is an author that I've discovered recently, even though I'm kind of late to the party. I would call this like soft, feel-good sci-fi that is extremely character-driven. So if you enjoy books that follow characters who are mostly nice people in their day-to-day lives with mild conflict periodically and don't need like a super strong plot, but love characters that you can really fall for, this is a sci-fi book that I would recommend to you that's not going to get too science-y if you're uncomfortable with that. This is The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers, and I really loved it. I think the world building is really good. It follows this very quirky, diverse crew on a spaceship on their adventures in space, and it like complaints that I hear is that there wasn't enough plot. Fair. If you need a really strong plot, this may not be for you. This may not be for you. There is a plot, but it's slow getting to the plot points, and there's a lot of in-between downtime of just like getting to know the characters and hanging out with them while they're on a planet and hanging out with them while they're going shopping in the marketplace. And like, if you like that sort of thing, you will probably love Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, and it has some like science-y sci-fi stuff to it as well. But if you need like action and a strong plot, then probably skip this one. But I really, really loved it. So I'm going to recommend this as a good soft entry point into sci-fi. Then I have 2 recommendations for sci-fi that I think is very readable, focused on characters and politics or political intrigue more than it is on spacey action, especially in these particular books. And so I think these are also good entry points if that interests you. The first one is a favorite, and this also has a very big following. I'm going to recommend Red Rising by Pierce Brown. I absolutely love this, and also if you like the school trope of things happening in sort of a school setting, Book 1 will give that to you. I love it, not everybody does. So this series takes place on Mars in a world that is kind of a reimagining of the Roman Empire near its falling point. Society is set up in a very strict caste system, and at the lowest levels are the Reds. And so we follow a Red named Darrow, whose wife dies as a martyr for the resistance of wanting to see change. And so after her death, he ends up being recruited into the resistance to go undercover to try to overthrow the Empire. And that's kind of what the first trilogy is about. It's really, really great. I love it. One thing that I love about Pierce Brown too is he writes wonderful female characters. He writes interesting, strong, complex women who are not like cookie cutter, who are not overly sexualized. They have agency, and not all male writers, especially in sci-fi and fantasy, will do that. And so I think if that's something that makes you nervous reading like sci-fi, he is a really good author to check out. I am a fan of the series, so I'm going to recommend this for sure. And I think it's a good entry point without getting too techie or sciencey, at least in book 1. I think later on it gets a little bit more of that, but book 1 is definitely like a good easy entry point. Similarly, one that I just finished reading is A Memory Called Empire by Arkady Martine. This is another one that is science fiction, but it's really focused on characters and world building and political intrigue. It follows a young ambassador from a small space outpost on her first trip to the capital city of this large galactic empire where she's going to be an ambassador on behalf of her people. She's going to replace her recently deceased predecessor and secretly carries a technology called an imago that's embedded in her brain that is supposed to carry the personality and memories of her predecessor to integrate with her personality and help her better navigate this new culture and place that she's going to be dealing with. However, it is 15 years out of date and isn't perhaps integrating as well as it's supposed to, and so she is thrust into this very dangerous maelstrom of political ambitions and secrets and different agendas, and has to kind of find her way through that in this complicated culture that she's not super used to. It's really, really good. I loved it a whole lot. I think if you like character-driven stories, if you're used to reading fantasy that focuses a lot on character development, focuses a lot on detailed world building, then this might be a really good pick for you to go into sci-fi. And I think thematically too, it deals with a lot of really interesting issues about like class systems and justice and empire. I liked it a lot. I think it's a pretty impressive debut, and another one that I could see being a good crossover for certain types of fantasy readers looking to get into sci-fi. Okay, 2 more recommendations, and both of these are books that I would say are a combination of science fiction and fantasy. These are really crossover novels that have some sci-fi elements, some fantasy elements mashed together. The first was a book that I really loved last year. This is another one that you can like, and this is true often, I think, with these specific niche genres. This is a book that you might love or hate, depending, but I really, really loved it. This is Gideon the Ninth by Tamsyn Muir. This was pitched as lesbian necromancers in space, which I would say is accurate. It definitely follows queer necromancers. It does take place in space. The necromancy and the sort of semi-magical, semi-technological elements to it read a little bit like fantasy. I will say though, this is not a romance. What it actually turns into is an isolated closed circle murder mystery mixed in with some body horror. And I really, really enjoyed it, partly because I loved Gideon. This is all told, book 1 is all told from the perspective of Gideon, who is extremely irreverent, and I found her super entertaining. I think if you start reading this and you don't like Gideon, this probably won't work for you. Probably won't work for you. But I really liked Gideon a whole lot, and I loved this book. Very excited for the sequel, Harrow the Ninth, which is all from Harrow's perspective. She's a side character in here. I will say it is very complicated. There are a lot of characters, there are a lot of different houses, and so I will recommend that you read and reference the Dramatis Personae here that will tell you who the characters are, what house they're in, and why that matters, because otherwise you may lose track. So that's my recommendation, but Gideon the Ninth is another one that's kind of a sci-fi fantasy crossover that I think is worth checking out. And my final recommendation for this video is the first book in one of my personal favorite sci-fi fantasy series. It is an intense one, but I think it is worth it, guys. It's so worth doing. This is the 5th season by N.K. Jemisin, winner of the Hugo Award in 2016. And in fact, every book in the trilogy won the Hugo, which is, I think, pretty impressive. I think this series is absolutely brilliant, and it definitely mixes together sci-fi and fantasy elements. It has sort of a magic system called orogeny and focuses on these people who are called orogenes, who are able to like affect the earth in various ways. And it starts out reading more like magic and fantasy, but eventually you really do get sci-fi things as well, not to like say too much about it. It's another one that is very focused on characters, on world, and thematically it's incredibly rich. It addresses things like oppression and systems of oppression. It addresses motherhood and complicated family relationships and identity. I think that these are amazing and brilliant and well worth getting into. They are definitely a little bit more dense. A lot is going on here, but I am a huge fan of this book and of this entire series. I think they're so good. So there you go. Those are the 5 adult books that I'm going to recommend if you are a fantasy reader looking to get into sci-fi. Hopefully this video was helpful for you. I hope you found some recommendations of books that sound like they might be in your wheelhouse to get some entrance into the world of science fiction, which is a really, really wonderful world and has lots of different sort of subgenres and niches, and I think everybody can kind of find their place here. Talk to me in the comments down below. Let me know any of your thoughts or feelings on any of the books that I talked about today. And if you have any other recommendations of books that you think would fit well in this category of sci-fi books that would be great for fantasy readers, drop them in the comments down below, and maybe people can find even more recommendations that way. For your question of the day in the comments down below, let me know what kind of a sci-fi reader you are. Do you read sci-fi at all? Does it make you nervous? Are you excited to try to get into it and you're just looking for some recommendations? Or are you a big sci-fi reader who's looking to get into fantasy? Because I feel like things could also work the opposite way for some of these books. I'm curious to hear from you. Let me know in the comments down below. If you guys like this video, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe if you want to see more. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.